few minutes past 7 in the morning, 60 miles east of the island of Samar, a lookout on a small American destroyer called out masts on the northern horizon. They were the wrong shape. They were too tall, too heavy, and too many. Through the haze, the outlines resolved into something no one in that part of the sea was supposed to be looking at. Battleships, heavy cruisers, a line of enemy destroyers behind them. The largest surviving surface fleet in the Imperial Japanese Navy had come through the night undetected, and it was steaming straight toward a handful of thin-skinned American carriers that had no business fighting anything. Between that fleet and those carriers sat the destroyer USS Johnston. She displaced about 2,000 tons. Her biggest guns were 5 inches across. Coming toward her were 4 battleships, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, carrying guns 18 inches across that could throw a shell the weight of a small car for 20 miles. The Navy's official count of the force that appeared that morning was 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 23 warships. On the bridge of the Johnston, her captain did the one thing the enemy would not have predicted. He did not run. He ordered his engines to full power, swung the ship hard toward the Japanese line, and began laying a wall of smoke to hide the carriers behind him. Then he ordered the Johnston to attack. This is the story of how one destroyer and her crew charged the heaviest gun line afloat, why her captain had promised years earlier that he would never do anything else, and what it cost the men who followed him in. To understand why the Johnston was there, you have to go back a single day to one of the largest naval battles in human history. In October 1944, American forces landed on the island of Leyte to begin retaking the Philippines. The invasion put thousands of troops ashore and left a crowded anchorage of transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf. Japan understood that if it could not stop this landing, the war in the Pacific was effectively lost. So the Imperial Navy committed nearly everything it had left to a complex plan built around deception. The plan had 3 parts. A decoy force of aircraft carriers, nearly empty of planes, would sail from the north to lure the powerful American Third Fleet away. While the Americans chased the decoy, 2 Japanese surface forces would slip through the Philippine Islands and fall on the vulnerable invasion fleet from 2 directions. The southern force was destroyed in the dark waters of Surigao Strait on the night of the 24th. The central force, the strongest of them, was commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and built around the battleships Yamato and Musashi. American carrier planes hammered Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea on the 24th and sank the giant Musashi. Watching the battered Japanese ships turn away to the west, American commanders concluded the central force was finished. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, took the bait to the north and went after the decoy carriers with his battleships and fleet carriers. The move left the San Bernardino Strait, the back door to Leyte Gulf, unguarded by heavy ships. Kurita's force was not finished. In the darkness it reversed course, passed through the empty strait, and turned south along the coast of Samar. According to the Naval History and Heritage, a few minutes past 7 in the morning, 60 miles east of the island of Samar, a lookout on a small American destroyer called out masts on the northern horizon. They were the wrong shape. They were too tall, too heavy, and too many. Through the haze, the outlines resolved into something no one in that part of the sea was supposed to be looking at. Battleships, heavy cruisers, a line of enemy destroyers behind them. The largest surviving surface fleet in the Imperial Japanese Navy had come through the night undetected, and it was steaming straight toward a handful of thin-skinned American carriers that had no business fighting anything. Between that fleet and those carriers sat the destroyer USS Johnston. She displaced about 2,000 tons. Her biggest guns were 5 inches across. Coming toward her were 4 battleships, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, carrying guns 18 inches across that could throw a shell the weight of a small car for 20 miles. The Navy's official count of the force that appeared that morning was 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 23 warships. On the bridge of the Johnston, her captain did the one thing the enemy would not have predicted. He did not run. He ordered his engines to full power, swung the ship hard toward the Japanese line, and began laying a wall of smoke to hide the carriers behind him. Then he ordered the Johnston to attack. This is the story of how one destroyer and her crew charged the heaviest gun line afloat, why her captain had promised years earlier that he would never do anything else, and what it cost the men who followed him in. To understand why the Johnston was there, you have to go back a single day to one of the largest naval battles in human history. In October 1944, American forces landed on the island of Leyte to begin retaking the Philippines. The invasion put thousands of troops ashore and left a crowded anchorage of transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf. Japan understood that if it could not stop this landing, the war in the Pacific was effectively lost. So the Imperial Navy committed nearly everything it had left to a complex plan built around deception. The plan had three parts. A decoy force of aircraft carriers, nearly empty of planes, would sail from the north to lure the powerful American Third Fleet away. While the Americans chased the decoy, two Japanese surface forces would slip through the Philippine Islands and fall on the vulnerable invasion fleet from two directions. The southern force was destroyed in the dark waters of Surigao Strait on the night of the 24th. The central force, the strongest of them, was commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and built around the battleships Yamato and Musashi. American carrier planes hammered Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea on the 24th and sank the giant Musashi. Watching the battered Japanese ships turn away to the west, American commanders concluded the central force was finished. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, took the bait to the north and went after the decoy carriers with his battleships and fleet carriers. The move left the San Bernardino Strait, the back door to Leyte Gulf, unguarded by heavy ships. Kurita's force was not finished. In the darkness it reversed course, passed through the empty strait, and turned south along the coast of Samar. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, Kurita never received clear word that Halsey had chased the decoy, and he spent much of the coming battle uncertain of where the American fleet actually was. The only thing standing in the gap that morning was a group of small escort carriers. There were three such groups, known by their radio call signs as Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. The northernmost, Taffy 3, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. It had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. These were not warships built to fight a battle line. The escort carriers were converted from merchant hulls. They were slow, thinly plated, and carried planes meant to support troops on the beach, not sink battleships. Sailors nicknamed them jeep carriers, and one common joke held that the letters on their hulls, CVE, stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. At dawn on the 25th of October, this was the force that Kurita's battleships found. The captain of the Johnston was Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, and to understand the charge, you have to understand him first. Evans was born in 1908 in Pawnee, Oklahoma. He was of Cherokee and Creek ancestry, and at the Naval Academy his classmates gave him the nickname Chief. He graduated in 1931 and spent the next decade as a career destroyer officer. When the war began, he was serving in the East Indies aboard the old destroyer Alden. That posting shaped everything that came after. In early 1942, Evans fought at the Battle of the Java Sea, a disastrous defeat in which a scratch Allied fleet was cut apart by the Japanese Navy and forced into retreat. He had watched Allied ships lost and Allied forces pull back, and by the accounts of those who knew him, he never made peace with it. In October 1943, he was given command of a brand new Fletcher-class destroyer, the USS Johnston. The Fletchers were the workhorses of the American destroyer fleet, fast ships capable of 38 knots, armed with 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes. At the commissioning ceremony, Evans spoke to his new crew in words that would be quoted for the rest of the century. He told them plainly, "This is going to be a fighting ship." He said he intended to take her into harm's way, and he warned that any man who did not want to go into danger had better ask for a transfer while he still could. He added that now that he had a fighting ship, he would never again retreat from an enemy force. His crew came to believe him. His gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagan, later described Evans as a natural fighter and said the crew felt they were on a first-rate ship because of the man who commanded it. Evans drove his gunners hard in drill. Off Guam, earlier in 1944, the Johnston had fired so long in support of the landings that her gun barrels glowed, and Evans demanded extra ammunition beyond the ship's normal allowance to keep firing. The Johnston had already sunk a Japanese submarine and earned a reputation as an aggressive ship with an aggressive captain. On the morning of the 25th, that reputation was about to be tested against odds no destroyer captain ever expected to face. Dawn came quietly. Taffy 3 was steaming off Samar, launching aircraft for another routine day of supporting the troops ashore. At about 6:45, lookouts spotted anti-aircraft fire in the sky to the north, and one of the group's own patrol planes radioed an urgent report of enemy battleships and cruisers dead ahead. On the American ships, the first reaction was disbelief. The heavy Japanese force was supposed to be 100 miles away and retreating. Within 3 minutes, colored shell splashes began rising among the escort carriers. The Japanese used dyed shells so each ship could spot its own fire, and now the water around Taffy 3 was streaked with pink and green and yellow. It was proof that the impossible had happened. A battle line was firing on them. The mismatch was almost beyond description. The Japanese heavy guns outranged the American 5-inch guns several times over. The Japanese ships were faster than the escort carriers, which could make only about 18 knots at best. On paper, Taffy 3 should have been annihilated within the hour, and every man in the formation understood it. Lieutenant Hagen later compared the situation to the biblical fight between David and Goliath. Except, he said, David had been armed. Rear Admiral Sprague did the only things he could. He turned his carriers away toward a rain squall to the east, ordered every plane into the air with whatever weapons happened to be loaded, and put out a call for help. Then he gave the order that would define the battle. He told his screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts to lay smoke and to attack. He did not have to give that order to the Johnston. Her captain had already turned toward the enemy. The Johnston went to full power and drove straight at the oncoming fleet, trailing a thick curtain of white smoke to blind the Japanese gunners and hide the carriers behind her. This was the maneuver Evans had trained his crew to perform. A destroyer's best weapon against a battleship was the torpedo, and torpedoes had to be delivered up close. To use them, Evans had to close the range against ships that could destroy him long before he arrived. As the range fell to about 10 miles, the Johnston opened fire on the nearest large target, the heavy cruiser Kumano, at the head of the Japanese cruiser column. In roughly 5 minutes of sprinting toward the enemy, the Johnston fired more than 200 rounds from her 5-inch guns. These shells could not sink a cruiser, but they could wreck exposed equipment, start fires, and force the enemy to react. Then, under the direction of her torpedo officer, Lieutenant Jack Bechdel, the Johnston reached the edge of torpedo range and launched all 10 of her torpedoes in a single spread, before swinging hard about and diving back into her own smoke. A minute later, when she came out the far side, the crew could see the result. The Kumano was burning. One of the Johnston's torpedoes had struck her forward and blown off her bow. The cruiser fell out of the fight and turned away, and the damage forced her and another cruiser out of the battle. A single destroyer had taken one of Japan's heavy cruisers out of the line in the opening minutes. The Johnston had gone in first and alone, but she did not stay alone. Rear Admiral Sprague's order to attack sent the other 2 destroyers of Taffy 3 in behind her. The Howell and the Heermann drove into the same wall of fire, and the smaller destroyer escorts, led by the Samuel B. Roberts, followed. These were ships even lighter than the Johnston, and their captains took them to within a few thousand yards of Japanese battleships to launch torpedoes. The Howell bore straight for the battleship Congo and fired, then turned on a heavy cruiser and fired again, absorbing hit after hit as she went. For a few minutes, the sea off Samar held the strange sight of a handful of tiny American ships chasing and being chased among the heaviest warships afloat, each destroyer trying to force the enemy to turn, to comb torpedo tracks, to look away from the carriers for just a little longer. Every minute the Japanese spent dodging and maneuvering was a minute the escort carriers used to run. It was the high point of the charge, and it did not last. The Japanese had now found the range. As the Johnston came clear of her smoke, the sea around her erupted. 3 large-caliber shells slammed into the ship almost at once, followed seconds later by 3 smaller shells that struck the bridge. The record here is worth being careful about, because it shows how confused this kind of fighting was. The Johnston's own crew recorded the heavy hits as 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo. Later analysts have pointed out that Congo may have been masked by a rain squall at that moment, and that the battleship caliber hits may in fact have come from Yamato, whose gunners logged hits on what they believed was a cruiser. The Johnston's crew could not have known which giant had hit them. What they knew was the effect. The heavy shells tore through the ship's after section, knocked out one of her 2 engine rooms, cut her speed roughly in half, and destroyed 3 of her 5 main guns. The smaller shells shredded the bridge. Commander Evans himself was badly wounded. The blast tore the shirt from his back and took off 2 of the fingers on his left hand. He wrapped the hand in a handkerchief, refused to leave the bridge, and kept fighting the ship. A quirk of the weather saved the Johnston in that moment. The same rain squall that Sprague had steered his carriers toward now swept over the crippled destroyer and hid her from Japanese gunners for a few minutes. In that pause, damage control parties worked to bring 2 of the afterguns back into action and to keep the ship moving on her 1 remaining engine. When the Johnston came out of the rain, she was slower, half-wrecked, and still in the fight. Evans could have used the cover to slip away. The carriers he was protecting were still under fire, and other ships of Taffy 3 were now driving in to attack. He turned the Johnston back toward the enemy. What followed was close to an hour of a single damaged destroyer inserting herself between the Japanese heavy ships and the American carriers, over and over. At one point, a Congo-class battleship loomed out of the smoke only about 7,000 yards off the Johnston's beam. It was a target no destroyer captain would ordinarily choose, a battleship at point-blank range for naval gunnery. Lieutenant Hagen opened fire anyway. By his account, the Johnston got off around 30 rounds in 40 seconds and landed roughly 15 hits on the battleship's towering superstructure. The 5-inch shells could not penetrate the battleship's armor, but they could rake its upper works. The battleship fired back and, for once, missed. The Johnston disappeared into the smoke again. The Japanese formation was coming apart. The furious, close-range attacks by the American destroyers, combined with constant strikes from the escort carrier's aircraft, convinced Kurita that he was fighting something far larger than he was. According to analysis published by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the aggression of the 3 destroyers helped confirm Kurita's mistaken belief that he faced a strong force of fleet carriers and cruisers rather than a thin screen of escort ships. Ships that will charge battleships are not supposed to be expendable. The Americans' willingness to die bought a lie the enemy believed. Then Evans saw one of his carriers in serious trouble. The escort carrier Gambier Bay had been caught by Japanese cruisers and was being shot to pieces. Evans ordered his gunners to open fire on the cruiser attacking her, deliberately drawing the enemy's attention onto the Johnston and away from the carrier. It was the logic that governed his entire morning. A destroyer that dies drawing fire has done its job. The Gambier Bay was lost anyway, the only American aircraft carrier of the war sunk by enemy surface gunfire. But the Johnston had done what she could. The last real service the Johnston performed came against the Japanese destroyers. Late in the battle, a squadron of enemy destroyers moved in to make a torpedo attack on the American carriers. If those torpedoes reached the escort carriers, the slaughter would be finished. Evans placed his crippled ship directly across their path in a classic maneuver known as crossing the T, turning the Johnston so her guns could fire full broadsides, while the oncoming enemy could only reply with their forward guns. By now the Johnston had fired off all her torpedoes and was running low on everything. She fought with guns alone. Her gunners concentrated on the lead enemy destroyer and scored about a dozen hits, and the destroyer turned away. The next ship in the column took several hits and also turned aside. The whole enemy squadron broke off, launched their torpedoes early and from long range, and the spreads missed. A single ruined destroyer had spoiled the attack. That was the end of what the Johnston could give. She had no torpedoes, was down to a fraction of her guns, and was losing power. The enemy was closing in from several directions at once. If stories like this are why you are here, subscribe to Warfront so the next one finds you. By around 9:30 in the morning, the Johnston was slowing to a stop. Her last engine failed. She lost power to her guns and her steering. When the steering control aft was destroyed and Evans could no longer con the ship from the bridge, he moved to the fantail at the very back of the ship and shouted his orders down through an open hatch to sailors who were turning the heavy rudder by hand. His Medal of Honor citation records this exactly, that with his engine power and steering gone, he shifted command to the stern and called steering orders through a hatch to men hauling the rudder over by muscle, and kept fighting until the ship, burning and shuddering from a mortal blow, lay dead in the water after 3 hours of combat. With the Johnston stopped and helpless, the Japanese ships closed in and circled her, firing at a target that could no longer maneuver or effectively fire back. Survivors later described the enemy ships making a slow ring around the dying destroyer, pouring in fire from every side. Below and around the guns, the decks were covered with the dead and the wounded. One officer who survived recalled seeing a heap of men, some living and some not, where the shells had struck. At about 9:45, with his ship shattered and sinking and nothing left to fight with, Commander Evans gave the hardest order a captain can give. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. Around 25 minutes later, the Johnston rolled over and went down by the bow. A Japanese destroyer reportedly closed to within about 1,000 yards and put a final shell into her to be sure she sank. What happened next has become one of the most repeated moments of the battle, and it needs to be told carefully. Several survivors in the water said that as the Johnston went under, The crew of the nearby Japanese destroyer stood at attention and saluted the sinking American ship. One survivor, Clint Carter, recalled seeing an officer he took to be the enemy captain saluting from the bridge wing. This account rests on survivor testimony rather than on any Japanese record, and it should be understood that way, as something men in the water believed they saw in the middle of a catastrophe. It has never been confirmed from the other side. It endures because of what it would mean if it were true, one enemy acknowledging another. The fate of Commander Evans himself was never established. He was seriously wounded. He lived long enough to give the order to abandon ship, and he was last seen on deck. He went into the water with his men and was never seen again. His body was not recovered. His name is carved on the walls of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery. He became the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive the Medal of Honor. Sinking the ship was not the end of the ordeal. For the men of the Johnston and the other lost ships of Taffy 3, the worst was still ahead of them. Because of confusion and faulty position reports, rescue did not come quickly. The survivors were left floating in the open Pacific for roughly 2 days. They clung to rafts and floater nets and each other, without shelter from the sun, with little or no water, in seas known for sharks. Men died of their wounds. Men died of exposure and thirst. Men were taken by sharks. By the time rescue ships finally reached the scattered survivors, many who had lived through the battle had not lived through the wait. The numbers for the Johnston alone tell the story plainly. Of a crew of 327 aboard that day, only 141 were saved. 186 were lost. Of those, roughly 50 were killed by enemy fire during the battle. Around 45 died on the rafts from their injuries, and 92 men, including Commander Evans, were alive in the water after the Johnston sank, but were never heard from again. They are the ones the sea took during those 2 days. The reason the wait was so long is its own small tragedy. In the confusion of the battle, the reports of where the survivors had gone into the water were wrong, and the first search efforts looked in the wrong places. Rescue vessels reached some groups of men only after they had drifted for days across open water. When the boats finally arrived, sailors who had survived a fight against battleships were pulled from the sea sunburned, delirious, and fewer in number than when they had gone in. Some men had slipped away from the rafts in the night. Others had been taken. The survivors carried the memory of those 2 days for the rest of their lives. Across all of Taffy 3, more than 1,000 American sailors died off Samar. It was a heavier loss of life than the United States Navy suffered at the Battle of Midway. These were not numbers to the families who received the telegrams, and this channel will not pretend the courage came free. The men who charged the battleships were killed by the choice to charge them. That is what the decision cost. And here the battle produced its strangest turn. At the moment when Kurita's battleships and cruisers were finally in position to close in and methodically destroy the remaining American carriers, the Japanese fleet broke off. Kurita ordered his ships to regroup and then to withdraw. He turned north and eventually took his fleet back out through the San Bernardino Strait and away. The invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf, the transports and supply ships that had no protection left, were never attacked. Historians have argued about Kurita's decision ever since, and it is worth being honest that there is no single agreed answer. The most common explanation is the one the battle itself suggests. The reckless, sacrificial attacks by the destroyers, the endless air strikes from the escort carriers, the smoke, the torpedo tracks, and the losses among his own cruisers convinced Kurita that he had run into a major American fleet, including full-sized carriers, and that heavier forces were on their way. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, to the combined surface and air attacks. Believing he faced destruction if he lingered, and uncertain to the end